December 24th, 1944, Lower Saxony, Germany. The wind howled across the flat plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of frozen pine, coal smoke, and the metallic tang of oncoming snow. Inside the perimeter of Stalag III-B, the world had shrunk to the size of a searchlight beam. Arthur Miller, a 35-year-old American sergeant from Ohio, pulled his collar tighter against the biting chill. He had been a prisoner for 5 months, captured during the chaotic retreat through the Ardennes forest. His world was one of gray concrete, rusted wire, and the hollow, gnawing ache of a stomach that had not been full since the middle of August. The other men in Barracks 12 were silent, huddled together for warmth on thin pallets of straw, their breathing heavy with the weight of exhaustion and a deep, soul-crushing despair. It was Christmas Eve, though the word seemed to have lost its meaning in a place where God felt like a distant memory, and the sun never quite managed to break through the leaden clouds. Arthur stepped out of the barracks to clear his head, his lungs stinging with the frigid air as the snow began to crunch under his worn, salt-stained boots. The camp was supposed to be silent after 10 o'clock, a dead zone of mud and shadows. But as he moved toward the edge of the western fence where the light was dimmest, he heard it. It was faint at first, a thread of sound so delicate he thought his mind was finally playing tricks on him. It was not the harsh, rhythmic bark of a German guard, or the heavy clank of a metal gate swinging on its hinges. It was a voice, a woman's voice. She was singing a lullaby. The melody was haunting, drifting from the direction of the old infirmary barracks, a place where the sick were sent, and from which few ever truly returned. Arthur stopped dead in his tracks, his heart hammering against his ribs like a bird in a cage. The song was in German, but the tenderness in the notes crossed every border, every trench, and every ideology. It was a sound of home, of safety, of a life that existed before the world fell apart into fire and steel. You are probably wondering how a woman's voice could be heard in a camp designed strictly for male prisoners of war, or why a seasoned sergeant would risk a summary execution just to find its source. The answer to that question, and the terrifying secret hidden inside the rotting walls of Barracks 9, is what the next 30 minutes are about. Before we continue, I want to ask for your help. Please subscribe to our channel and help me prove that these stories still matter. Now, let us go back to that frozen night in 1944. Arthur followed the sound, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the supply sheds and the laundry vats. The searchlight swept the yard in a predictable arc, a long, inquisitive finger of white light that he dodged with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that visibility was a death sentence. He reached the rear of Barracks 9. The wood was black with rot, the windows covered in a thick, crystalline layer of frost that looked like jagged teeth. The singing was louder now, coming from a small, boarded-up room at the very end of the building, a space originally meant for storing cleaning chemicals. Arthur found a loose board and pried it back just enough to see inside. The room was barely a closet, lit by a single, guttering candle stub that smelled of tallow. On a pile of damp rags in the corner sat a woman. She was young, perhaps 25, but her face was a map of tragedy. Her hair was matted with grease and dirt, her coat was torn at the shoulder, but her eyes were fixed with a terrifying, singular intensity on the bundle in her arms. It was a child, a boy, no older than 3 years old, his face flushed with a deep, angry fever that looked like it was consuming him from the inside out. Arthur gasped, the sound escaping his lips before he could stop it, and the woman froze. Her head snapped toward the wall, her eyes wide and feral, filled with the protective instinct of a mother who has already lost everything else. "Who is there?" she whispered in German, her voice trembling but sharp. Arthur hesitated for a heartbeat. He was an enemy, a prisoner, a man who should have been in his bunk, awaiting roll call. But the sight of the child in a place designed for nothing but slow death broke the last of his military discipline. "It is okay," he whispered back in his broken soldier's German. "I am a friend. I am an American." The woman did not relax. Her grip on the boy tightened until her knuckles were white. "They will kill him," she said, her voice a jagged sob. "If the commandant finds him, they will send us to the east. My husband was a guard here. He was a good man, Hans. He was killed in the fighting at Voronezh. They let me work in the kitchen because I had nowhere else to go, but they do not know about Peter. He is sick. He is so sick." Arthur looked at the boy's chest, watching the way it labored. The breathing was shallow and raspy, a wet, rattling sound that Arthur had heard too many times on the battlefields of France. It was the sound of a lung infection, a silent killer that flourished in the damp, unheated corners of the camp. "I have medicine," Arthur said, though the lie felt like copper in his mouth. He did not have medicine, but he knew where the German staff kept their supplies. The camp's medical officer, a man named Schneider, was a brute who enjoyed the power of his position, but he kept a locked cabinet of sulfa powder, aspirin, and bandages for the guards. Arthur knew he was signing his own death warrant if he was caught near that cabinet, but he looked at the woman's face and saw his own sister, back in Cincinnati, holding her newborn son just weeks before he shipped out. "I will be back," Arthur promised. "Do not stop singing. If I hear the song, I will know you are still safe." For the next 3 weeks, a secret and desperate war was fought inside Stalag III-B. It was not a war of bullets or bayonets, but a war of calories, chemistry, and nerves. Arthur began a dangerous game of barter that would have baffled the camp's administrators. He traded his gold wedding ring, hidden in his boot since his capture, to a sympathetic Czech cook for extra bread and a jar of honey. He began to coordinate with a small group of trusted prisoners who had nothing left to lose. They called themselves the Lullaby Network. There was Henry, a former pharmacist from London who had been captured at Dunkirk. He showed Arthur how to stretch the tiny amounts of stolen sulfa powder by mixing it with honey to make a paste that a child could swallow. There was Caleb, a carpenter from Maine, who spent his exercise hours loosening the floorboards in Barracks 9 so they could be moved silently without a single creak. Every night, Arthur would crawl through the freezing slush to deliver a small portion of thin soup, a piece of stolen chocolate, or a bit of coal for the tiny stove they had managed to rig up. And every night, Maria, the woman in the closet, would tell him a piece of her life. She was not just a kitchen worker. She had been a gifted music student in Berlin, dreaming of the opera before the bombings turned the city into a graveyard. She had met Hans in a park under the linden trees, a gentleman who played the violin and hated the uniform he was forced to wear. When Hans was sent to the Russian front and the letters stopped coming, Maria was left with nothing but a toddler and a paralyzing fear that the state would take him away to be raised in a Nazi orphanage. She had managed to hide Peter in a laundry crate when she was transferred to the camp, surviving on the gray scraps left by the officers. Arthur listened to her, and for those few minutes every night, the war ceased to exist. There was no Hitler, no Roosevelt, no front lines. There was only a mother, a child, and a man trying to remember what it felt like to be a human being instead of a number. But in a camp filled with 1,000 hungry men and 100 suspicious guards, secrets are never truly safe. It happened on a Tuesday morning in the middle of January. The temperature had plummeted to 20 degrees below zero, and the moisture in the air turned to needles of ice. A surprise inspection was announced by the sounding of the sirens. The guards were looking for a hidden radio they believed was being used to track the Soviet advance. Sergeant Kessler, a man with a reputation for cruelty that made even the other German NCOs turn away, led the search. He was a veteran of the First War, a man whose heart had been replaced by a rigid, unyielding devotion to the manual. Kessler did not find the radio in Barracks 12, but as he walked past the infirmary barracks, he stopped. He heard a sound that did not belong, a soft, rhythmic thumping. It was Peter, the 3-year-old, having a fit of coughing that could no longer be muffled by Maria's hand. Arthur was standing in the yard for roll call, his breath blooming in the air like white smoke, his heart stopping as he watched Kessler turn toward the back of Barracks 9. The sergeant did not hesitate. He kicked the door open, his heavy boots echoing like gunshots on the hollow floorboards. Arthur moved before his brain could process the risk. He stepped out of the line, breaking formation, and shouted in English at the top of his lungs. "Hey Kessler, you looking for the radio? It is in the latrine. I saw the Brits hiding it there this morning." Kessler paused, his hand already on the handle of the small closet door. He turned, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure malice. "You speak when spoken to, American dog." Arthur did not back down. He moved closer, his fists clenched, putting himself between the guard and the infirmary. "I am telling you where the radio is, or are you too afraid of what you will find to look in the right place?" Kessler's face turned a deep, angry purple. The insult to his efficiency stung more than the cold. He forgot about the strange sound in the closet. He walked toward Arthur, his hand reaching for the heavy wooden baton at his belt. "You want to be a hero, Miller. I will show you what we do with heroes in Stalag III-B. The beating was systematic and brutal. Arthur was dragged to the center of the compound, in full view of the other prisoners, and struck until he could no longer keep his eyes open. They left him lying in the snow for 4 hours, as a grim warning to the others. But as he lay there, his blood staining the white ground a dark, frozen crimson, he heard it. Faintly, through the thin walls of the infirmary, the lullaby began again. Peter was still safe. Arthur smiled through a mouthful of broken teeth. He had bought them another day, and in 1945, a day was an eternity. The end of the war was a slow, grinding collapse of everything the Germans had built. By April, the low, constant rumble of Allied artillery could be heard in the distance, sounding like an approaching summer storm. The guards became erratic. Some fled into the dark woods at night, while others became more violent and unpredictable, desperate to exert a dying control as their world turned to ash. The food shipments stopped coming altogether. The prisoners were reduced to eating boiled grass, strips of leather, and sawdust. Arthur, still limping heavily from the injuries he had sustained in January, knew that the final days would be the most treacherous. If the SS arrived to liquidate the camp before the Americans got there, Maria and Peter would be the first to be discovered and executed. He made a decision. He would not wait for liberation. He would take them out. On the night of April 12, 1945, the camp was in a state of soft, vibrating panic. The commandant had disappeared in a staff car hours ago, and the remaining guards were huddled in the guardhouse, drinking stolen schnapps and arguing about whether to surrender or run. Arthur gathered his small, skeletal team. "We are going tonight," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Through the western wire where Caleb cut the fence." The pharmacist and the carpenter nodded, their faces grim. They had prepared a hole in the double layer of chain link, disguised behind a pile of old refuse. Arthur reached the infirmary and tapped 3 times on the loose board. "Maria, it is time." The board was pushed aside, and Maria stepped out into the biting wind, carrying Peter wrapped in a stolen wool blanket. The boy was thin, his eyes huge and luminous in his pale, pinched face, but the fever was gone. He looked at Arthur and reached out a tiny, cold hand, clutching the sergeant's thumb. Arthur took it, and for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of a father's responsibility. They moved through the camp like ghosts. The spring snow had turned to a thick, gray slush that muffled their footsteps, but made every movement a struggle. They reached the fence, the wire humming in the wind like a ghostly choir. Caleb pulled back the cut section, and one by one, they slipped through the jagged metal into the unknown. They were in the woods now, the dark pines closing around them like a protective shroud. They ran for 3 miles, Maria carrying the boy until her legs gave out, and then Arthur taking him, despite the pain in his ribs and the weakness in his heart. They reached a small, abandoned stone hut near a frozen stream. It was there that they waited, huddled together for warmth, listening to the world burn in the distance. 2 days later, the ground began to shake with a different kind of vibration. It was not the random thud of artillery, but the steady, mechanical roar of heavy engines. They were not German engines. They were the high-pitched whine of Shermans. The 11th Armored Division had arrived at the crossroads. Arthur stood in the middle of the muddy road, his hands raised high, his voice cracking and raw as he shouted his name and serial number over and over. The American soldiers jumped from their tanks, their faces filled with a mixture of horror and profound awe at the walking skeletons that were emerging from the forest. Arthur led a young captain named Shapiro back to the stone hut. Inside, Maria was singing the lullaby to Peter to keep him calm. Shapiro, a man from New Jersey who thought he had seen everything, took one look at the woman and the child and began to weep openly. He called for medics, for blankets, for the best rations they had in the supply trucks. He looked at Arthur, who was leaning against a tree for support, and asked, "How did you keep them alive in there for so long?" Arthur looked at Maria and the boy. "I did not do it," he said. "The song did." You might think the story ends there, with a clean transition to a happy life. But the reality of 1945 was much more complex. Arthur was sent to a military hospital in France to recover from his injuries and the effects of starvation. Maria and Peter, as German nationals, were taken to a separate camp for displaced persons. In the absolute chaos of the post-war bureaucracy, they were separated. For 3 long years, Arthur Miller lived in a state of quiet torment. He returned to Cincinnati, took a job in a steel mill, and tried to forget the smell of Stalag III-B. But he could not forget the song. He spent every spare cent he had on private investigators and letters to the Red Cross. He wrote to the new German government, to the military police, to anyone who would listen. He was a man possessed, a ghost haunting the agencies of the old world. In the spring of 1948, a small package arrived at his doorstep in Ohio. It was wrapped in thick brown paper and tied with a simple, frayed string. Inside was a small, hand-carved wooden bird. It was the same toy that Caleb, the carpenter from Maine, had made for Peter in the barracks out of a piece of scrap pine. Attached to the bird was a note written in a careful, elegant script that Arthur knew better than his own name. Dear Arthur, we are in Munich. Peter is starting school this week. He still asks every morning for the American man who brought him the chocolate and the honey. I still sing the song to him every single night. Please come and find us. Arthur Miller left for Germany 2 weeks later, leaving his life in Ohio behind without a second thought. He did not just find them, he stayed. He married Maria in a small, sunlight-filled church in Munich in 1949. He officially adopted Peter as his own son, giving him the name Peter Miller. Arthur spent the rest of his long life working as a lead translator for the American occupation forces, helping thousands of other families find the scattered pieces of their lives that the war had shattered. Arthur died in 1992, in a house filled with the laughter of his children and grandchildren. At his funeral, Peter, now a man in his 50s with gray at his temples, stood before the mourners. He turned the small key, and the soft, tinkling notes of the Bavarian lullaby filled the quiet room. My father heard a sound in the dark, Peter said, his voice thick with emotion. And because he chose to listen when the rest of the world was deaf, I am standing here today. He taught me that even in a place built for nothing but hate, love can always find a way to breathe.